It's always, for me, a very special pleasure to welcome Tony Vidler to talk, or I should say, to talk again. This is actually now the 5th decade in which he's been talking here. So all the books that you've read by him or have seen in the library have all been represented at some point in their composition here. In the 70s, Tony was in the process of presenting here and elsewhere the work on Ledoux, which ended up in the book on Ledoux and the essays writing on the walls. And since then, the long chain of books have all been given at some stage in their composition, given as versions here. It adds up to anyone who's kind of heard those lectures a remarkable contribution to the life of the AA. This is not someone who kind of appears on and off, but his appearances have been completely kind of regular and always. I want just to say something about the sum of effects of that. Anyone who has listened to these lectures over a long series of decades, anyone who has read the books, realizes that they are dealing with a kind of remarkable intelligence. When one tries to analyze that, I mean, I think it's fair to say that Tony's writing combines almost in equal measure the temperament of an architect, the temperament of a scholar and a historian, and the temperament of a theorist. And this is not just a question of trying to list someone's virtues. These virtues kind of all fit together, or sometimes pull slightly in different directions. I mean, if I could kind of find a formula for it, his historical writing is always aware, in a way that many historians are not aware, of the irreducible level of theoretical problems that historical discourse brings with it. At the same time, for him, architectural theoretical speculation is not really worth it unless it's directed towards and fostered by architecture. Nothing could be further from kind of the character of Tony's intellect as to be one of those people who arrives every 5 years in architecture thinking the problem that this poor old thing architecture needs is a kind of whatever it might be, linguistics, economics, structuralism, phenomenology, and then it'll be put on a more kind of saleable footing. It's this the kind of wedding, the going together of the historical, the theoretical, and the architectural, which makes, I think, which explains in some sense to me, the central effect of his writings, which is at once to notice how careful it is, in many ways how intent to be precise, while and at the same time as radical or as imaginative as the topic requires. So I wanted to kind of say something on account of his contribution to the AA. Of course, this leaves me little time to identify all the works. You know those. And there is a prodigious list of all the places where he's been professing and deaning. But that seems to me, at the end of the day, less important to us and less important to him than the contribution he actually makes and has made for a long time to contemporary architecture. It's a great pleasure to welcome you this evening on the topic of occupation. Tony.
Having listened for many, many years to Mark Cousins introducing me, it has become clear to me, every introduction has been completely different from the one before. And we always have tea together or something like that before the lecture. And so it's become clear to me that every introduction is precisely what my psychoanalyst ought to have said to me before I came. And because he says it before I lecture, it has the most extraordinarily intimidating effect. But thank you, Mark. I will think on these things and try not to think about myself as I lecture tonight. And indeed, this talk is a work in progress. It's the last, part of the last chapter of a work that will come out in a small orange covers for the AA, edited by Tom Weaver, based on a series of seminars I gave 2 or 3 years ago on the question of utopia. What I want to talk about today is the question of heterotopia, which of course is the notion of space occupied. I want to say that I call this lecture Reflections because these are not worked out hypotheses. There are 1 or 2 things I think that we should think about that were rooted in the 60s and 70s of the last century, and that I think are worth rereading and rethinking, and will guide our rereading and rethinking as we look and experience and participate in the various kinds of occupations which have become so numerous and so passionate and so extraordinarily sometimes effective and sometimes extraordinarily dangerously ineffective over the last 3 or 4 years. So I want briefly to summarize and then open from discussion some selected thoughts that arise following the rise and spread of what's been called the occupation movement in New York, Frankfurt, Istanbul, and worldwide. I'd like to open up questions that surround the notion and the act of occupation in the light of previous historical experiences, both practical and theoretical. Because it's my hypothesis that any theorizing that emerges concerning the fact and the idea of space generally follows specific spatial acts. Thus we find that Plato's hypothetical proposals for the ideal city of the Republic and the laws stem from his own experience of Athenian democracy and its opponents. That the rediscovery of perspectival and representation emerges in a period of increased exploration. That the so-called science of urbanism is stimulated by the practice of Haussmann in the Second Empire. And that all the different theories of space as political after the Second World War, which is what we're going to be talking about, are developed in response both to wars themselves, world and post-colonial, and to the successive riots, occupations, and manifestations of the period around 1968. And if we understand architecture as a kind of theorization of space, then we can also see that architectural strategies, reformist and conservative, are equally responsive to political actions. Let me take two recent occupations as my starting point. Occupy Wall Street, September 17th, 2011. This intervention, a long-term sit-in, that's another earlier word for occupation, and we'll be talking a little bit about this word occupation and its double meanings, took place in an already defined architectural space. Originally named Liberty Park Plaza and damaged by the events of 9/11, it was renamed Zuccotti Park in 2006. For the park, while publicly accessible, had never been actually public property. It was created in 1986 by US Steel, the US Steel out of Pittsburgh, in negotiation with the city of New York so that they could build their building at 1 Liberty Plaza, which you see on the screen, higher than the zoning allowed. The US Steel building, completed in 1972, on the site, and that was completed, of course, by Skidmore, Owings and Merrill, was a site completed on the site of the old Singer building. The renaming of the park was to honor the chairman of Brookfield Financial Services, John Zuccotti. Thus, the public park was not in fact public, and much was made of this, especially by the New York Police Department, the mayor, and Brookfield's properties during the occupation. Wall Street, of course, was no stranger to demonstrations. Here's the scene of the place where Zuccotti Park will be in 1911. Here is the scene of one of the first bomb attacks on Wall Street in 1920. Here's the scene of the Wall Street crash of 1929. And of course, the bombing of 2000, and followed by the destruction of the Twin Towers in 9/11. And then a new kind of occupation, which is something I'll be talking about a little bit later, the occupation by architecture of the site, the recolonization of the site by this strange object called Liberty Tower, Freedom Tower, I guess. So there it is in all its shining glory. As Ronald Reagan might have said, here we go again. So Wall Street is our street, not so. Wall Street is nothing to do with their street, our street, your street, or my street. It's heavily indentured and owned and occupied already. So what interests me, though, in terms of the occupation movements, and this one and the Taksim occupation in general, is the way in which communities form. There's a whole archive now on the web of the maps of the communities that they formed, the spaces that they staked out, where the library was, where the kitchen was, where the speaking podium was. It was a small exercise, if you like, on a communal basis with many, many different groups and many, many different individuals who agreed only on one or two things, probably disagreed about many things, to develop a communal polis of some kind. And there's some of the maps that were drawn during the occupation showing people where things were. One of the most interesting parts of the occupation was, of course, the establishment of the occupation library, where we all went down and gave books to this library, and the library circulated, and one of the tragedies of the library was that when the police destroyed the encampment, it threw the library into the trash. The second example, the surprise occupation of Gezi Park, beginning with a group from Taksim Solidarity on May 28, 2013. There's Taksim Square and Gezi Park. The gassing, water cannoning, and firing of the tents grew larger and larger crowds, 100,000 plus by May 30th. The commune ended beginning on June 11th with successive police attacks until June 15th. And then the protests began and spread with opposition to the replacing of the park with a replica of the old Ottoman barracks. Barracks built at the end of the 18th, beginning of the 19th century. And when the Ottoman barracks became no longer serviceable as a military establishment, the site and within the barrack buildings was used from the 1920s on as a soccer pitch, a rallying point, a generally semi-public space. It was always owned privately, but used publicly. The barracks were demolished in 1940, and actually the replacement was a park designed by the French Beaux-Arts architect Henri Prost, some of which was completed, but in fact the whole park now is a little more than a large traffic island. This is the plan. These are the plans for the rebuilding of the Ottoman barracks as a hotel, come conference center, come mall. And here are plans that are posted on the web under the title of, in the site Post-Virtual. They were posted on June 27th by an anonymous member of the occupation of the Taksim Square under the title Historical Atlas of Gezi Park. And you can see that very carefully he's drawn a whole series of plans which show where the different groups were, where the different political groups, and this brought together a huge range, as you know, of political groups and the kinds of overlappings and mappings. These interest me a great deal because they refer me back to the kinds of sociological diagrams of social space that we'll be talking about in just a minute. This introduction has been a little of a tease because I'm not at this moment going to follow through with a deep structural analysis of these two occupations. Rather, what I want to do is to reflect on what these particular spatial interventions signify in the long history of such initiatives. The long history might hazard of popular resistance to the always far too settled norms of representative democracy. The Greeks knew all about the space of occupation. One example, the 404 BC defeat in democracy of Athens by the 30 tyrants, following the defeat of Athens by the Spartans, ending the Peloponnesian War. And in 403, the tyrants were defeated themselves by a motley crew of democrats, armed, as the story goes, with staves and stones, and recapturing the city with a rush from the port of Piraeus, where they had been assembled along the long walls that had been destroyed by the Spartans. And then the surprising outcome, a solemn oath sworn by the democratic victors, quote, not to recall the misfortunes of the past, but to, quote unquote, share the city with the defeated party of the tyrants, thus ending the civil war. Now we know that the word for civil war in Greece is stasis. So stasis ends in a stasis, which after all is the role of representative democracy. The Greek for civil war, stasis, a word which means also partisanship, faction, sedition, but equally, as we say it now, stasis. A stasis is resolved that is through and in stasis. A stasis or civil war that refuses to stay put outside the city, but that is itself born within the city. What the historian Nicole Leroux has termed the divided city, the polis of Athens, settled into an internal division that, in one sense at least, prefigures our own democratic structure of settling disputes through a form of stasis known as voting consensus. Now, this would be simply an oft-repeated historical sequence of events if it hadn't been for Plato, who was some 23 years old when the tyrants took over democracy, and he himself was a relative of two of them, Critias, his mother's cousin, and Charmides, his uncle. And he was a student, of course, of the philosopher Socrates. Socrates, as we know, was to be indicted and condemned by the Democrats, who probably correctly suspected him of corrupting the Athenian youth. He was certainly very friendly with many of the tyrants. So in 399, when Plato was 28, he took the proverbial hemlock. The result is itself history, that is, the sequence of some 43 dialogues written by Plato commemorating Socrates and featuring Socrates as a major questioner in the majority of the discourses, and two of them, the Critias and the Charmides, named after his relatives who were among the tyrants. Critias, of course, was the leader of the tyrants. These tell us all we know about Plato's teacher and about Plato himself. And it's in these dialogues we can discern the outline of Greek spatial theory, both as lived and imagined ideally. Theories that have marked Western and our own understandings of space ever since. And in tracing the whole theme of utopics through a number of utopian and practical experiments in redefining community and redefining politics after Plato, you find that it's, there was once a seminar I was in with listening to Jacques Derrida, who halfway through said, now we will return to Plato. My goodness, will we ever be short of Plato? Right. So in fact, we're not going to be short of Plato. And it's in the Republic, for example, that we first find the definition of the kind of territorial struggles that occupation brings to light. As Socrates says, then we will have to seize some of our neighbor's land if we're to have enough pasture and plow land for the city to grow. And won't our neighbors want to seize part of ours as well, if they too have surrendered themselves to the relentless acquisition of money and have overstepped the limits of their necessities? That's completely inevitable, Socrates. Then our next step will be war, Glaucon, won't it? It will. Indeed, we wouldn't be entirely wrong if we were to attribute the writing of these discourses, and notably the Republic, the Timaeus, the Critias, and the Statesman, and the Laws, to Plato's horror of the division represented by stasis, and his equally deep distrust of the democracy that had condemned his teacher. The antidote, Derrida will call it the pharmacon, would be the complex of rules of spatial organization that, implied in the Republic, were to be brought to life in the Timaeus and Critias and laid out as a model, spatialized as a constitution in the Laws. There's Tatkim Square, before and after, and the spread of the occupation movement. This is a diagram of the spatialization of the Republic. In the public, we're presented not with a divided city, but a city redivided. The zoning is clear. In one sector, on the top left, are the guardians, brought up to be perfect citizens. And in the other, the craftsmen, tradesmen, the non-citizen, and the slaves. In the guardians' quarter, all run free. Men and women alike bathe, play games, compete in sports, see each other naked, enter freely in and out of their houses. A small communist utopia, in other words. In the other quarter, all is work and constrained by time. There is, incidentally, as you can see, eaten out of, let's see if I have my, somewhere there was somebody gave me a pointer. There we go. This is a little place for the children who were to be separated from their parents, who would be not to be trusted to bring up good citizens, but who would be removed at a young age from their parents and brought up to be guardians. In the Timaeus and the Critias, however, we're presented with two mythical cities. The one, ancient Athens, a paradigm of modern Athens, what modern Athens should aspire to, and the other, Atlantis, a vision of luxury and corruption easily identified as Plato's view of the contemporary city of Athens, and in the myth defeated by ancient Athens. In the Statesman, we find that all will be well if the politicus follows the example of the architect in the good design of the laws. And in the laws, we find an elaborate spatial zoning that, though not as perfect as imagined in the Republic, will nevertheless serve as second-best version of an ideal. On the left, a diagram of what Atlantis would look like if it was depicted as a diagram after Plato's description, and on the right, a diagram of the city of the laws, with the Acropolis at the center, the city and its citizens at the center, radiating out to farms that they owned and moved backwards and forwards each year seasonally, so that the citizens farm the land and deal with the guardianship of the city, while the craftsmen work busily at organizing the tools and the equipment for the city. Here, the circles within circles circumscribed, well-defined areas for the citizen, the craftsman, the farmers, for the slaves, and so on. The diagram is both spatial and temporal, as it represents the diurnal movement of the citizen from the city to his farm. Several centuries later, another republic, this written by Jean-Jacques Rousseau, proposed a similar origin for territorial struggle. He writes, "The first who, having enclosed a piece of land, was inclined to say, 'This is mine,' and found those who were simple enough to believe him, was the true founder of civil society. How many crimes, wars, and murders, how many miseries and horrors would that man have saved the human species if, pulling up the stakes or filling in the ditch, he would have cried to his fellows, 'Be careful in listening to this impostor. You're lost if you forget that the earth belongs to no one person.'" So this is, again, already in the two republics, the Platonic Republic and the Rousseau's Republic, there is the establishment of the counter-democratic, counter-ownership, organization of a polis which gets rid of boundaries. Well, you remember those extraordinary essays by Deleuze and Guattari, where they distinguish between two forms of politicized space, the striated space that is organized in property and government, and the smooth space which is akin to the nomadic space of the nomad in the desert. What the Occupy movement is, to a certain extent, repeating is the sense that all space ought to be smooth and open, and yet it is precisely defined by the striated space against which it's fighting, but which at the same time gives it a place, if you like, to be. So the model of Plato's laws and Rousseau's Republic joined together become, of course, Ebenezer Howard's plan for the garden cities of tomorrow and many other plans of ideal cities before and after. But it's not my plan this evening to delve too deeply into the intermediate period between Plato and the present, although in my about-to-be-published book with the AA, which is called Gaming Utopia, I touch on many of these issues. Now I want to fast forward to the immediate post-war period after 45, to investigate the response of urban and architectural theorists to the increasing politics of spatial resistance from 1950 to the early 70s, the period during which most of our present theoretical assumptions around political space was also formulated. This was a period haunted by the threat of nuclear destruction. This is Hiroshima after the explosion of the bomb. Racked by the last round of colonial wars in Algeria and Vietnam, and in the world of architecture, resistant to the formula of international style modernism, and especially its effects on the redevelopment of cities. You've got Hilbersheimer on the left, Le Corbusier is Ville Contemporaine, and then Ville Voisin on the bottom left, the destruction of Saint-Dié in the center bottom, and then his plan for Saint-Dié, which to all intents and purposes is turning it into a smooth garden city. And the results of this, of course, are very evident in the Parisian banlieue, where much of this discussion that we'll be talking about took place. One of the first to begin to talk about social space in the period immediately after the war was a very interesting character called Paul-Henri Chambard de l'Aube. Chambard was a pilot and pioneered aerial photography during the First World War, hanging out of the back of an airplane with canvas wings with a Leica camera captured from the Germans. And so it was beginning to be a very interesting operation. He then became a sociologist and an anthropologist and turned after the war to study Paris with a great deal of observation from the air. These are some of his photographs, and of course, this again, the aerial photograph as a planning tool, which was celebrated by Corbusier, as you remember, in urbanism in 1925, was also a bombing tool, and it was also a control of population tool. And there were all kinds of uses for the surveillance from the air, even as there were uses in the 19th century of the sort of panopticism of the Bentham kind. Aerial photographs of Paris by Chambard, and the working out very carefully of small spatial units, whether they were dominated by commerce or education or certain kinds of living habits in Paris, identifying the micro, if you like, the microspatial organization of the city. A microspatial organization which was then given life and time, if you like, by the tracing, in this case, of the different journeys of a young student in the 18th arrondissement, the 16th arrondissement of Paris, showing in a way the extraordinary neighborhood-based life that Parisians in the 1950s undertook. Now, this particular study and the study of the micro neighborhoods of everyday life had an extremely powerful example on this character, who of course is Guy Debord, and on the situations in general. I'm not going to deeply involve myself this evening, but just to remind you that the notion of space broken up into small units, which will eventually, of course, become what Foucault, as we shall see, calls heterotopic space, is very present in the sociology of the 50s and in the ideology of situationism in the 50s. In fact, Debord actually republishes in the first issue of the Situationiste International in 1958 one of Chambard's drawings. And in a sense, the ambiguity and play between the science of urbanism and the understanding of urbanism as something to contest, that kind of dialogue and dialectic runs continuously through the thinkers that we will be talking about. The articles on a new urbanism, the wish to establish what he calls a carte de tendre, or a kind of an emotional and psychological sense of urban life, as opposed to the mechanical and geometrical impositions of urban life. Here, a photograph reprinted from Chambard of Paris, which will be used to define, against which will be used to define the new urbanism, the different definitions of the situationists of different kinds of constructed situations, situationism, situationist psychogeography, and so on. What is very interesting about the attack that Debord and his friends take against urbanism and the practice of urbanism is, in fact, not, except for a brief flirtation with Constant over a period of not very many months, not going to be precipitated in architectural plans. It is precipitated in the way one incorporates one's life in the city, the way one traces paths through the old quarter of Les Halles, for example, the way one begins to identify certain psycho areas, psychogeographic areas in Paris, here taking off from the supposedly Pascalian treatise on the passions of the soul, but actually inventing a way of mapping which is directly derived from the sociological mapping of Chambard and his friends, and then here in Naked City, that extraordinary vision of New York, now applied as a kind of voice off to Paris itself, and the beginnings of the inquiry into what is happening to our cities. And of course, the 65 riots in Detroit and Los Angeles were particularly important to the situationists. And at the very end, the last issue in 1968 of the International Situationist gives you a sense of the kind of impasse that Debord certainly felt at the frustration at the so-called failed revolution of '68. So, I want to talk about two individuals from that period who theorized space against this background, against the background of radical reinterpretation of space, radical reoccupation of space, and of course the radical appropriation of space in the cities themselves, whether they be prison riots or city riots. The two individuals I'm going to talk about to the second half of this lecture are, of course, Henri Lefebvre and Michel Foucault. Henri Lefebvre began to be interested in architecture by his friendship with a young student in his classes at Nanterre, Philippe Boudon, who published a little book for his thesis for Lefebvre on what had happened to Le Corbusier's Pessac. Well, you know what had happened. It had deteriorated, and these wonderful white cubes had been given the forms of houses as opposed to being white cubes. And what the study investigated was why and how, and of course at the time it was seen very much as a major indictment of the international style. Lefebvre didn't think this, however. He felt bold enough to write an introduction, a very interesting theoretical introduction to the Boudon book on Pessac, where he begins to outline his understanding of what he calls a little later social space. But Lefebvre had made his intellectual reputation long before the war in a series of works dedicated to the critical explication of philosophy from a Marxist perspective, and who had just after the war published the first 3 studies on everyday life, becoming interested in the social implications of habitat in rural areas, then in urban contexts from the 40s on. His dissertation research was actually carried out under the occupation in the Campin Valley in the Pyrenees. This sociological study of rural France became the subject of his doctorat d'etat in 1954. He then joined a research group at the CNRS, the Centre d'études sociales, together with a roster of interdisciplinary scholars, including Henri Vallon, the psychologist, who was, of course, the influence on Lacan, Marcel Mauss, Roland Barthes, and Philippe Boudon, who had been influenced by Lefebvre's writings on everyday life, and in turn a great influence on Lefebvre, who published his Everyday Life in the Modern World in 1968. Gradually turning from rural to urban studies, Lefebvre, together with a group of sociologists, founded the Institut Sociologie Urbain in 1962, dedicating his first studies to the population of the pavillon habitat, you see it there, and then as professor of sociology at Strasbourg, lecturing on urban theory. As Lukáš Stanek has traced in his remarkable study of Lefebvre, from which I'm drawing heavily in this paragraph, it was at this time that sociologists came into contact with Guy Debord, the radical leader of the Situationists. Debord, filmmaker and critical left writer, had broken with the Lettristes to found the Situationists, we know that. And Debord's theory of unitary urbanism, in opposition to the modern CIAM planning as applied to the Grand Ensemble, appealed to Lefebvre, as did Debord's interest in the idea of everyday life situations. And indeed, Debord was to publish Chambard's study, as we saw in the first issue. Through Debord, Lefebvre met Constant in the Netherlands, visiting his studio in Amsterdam and viewing his models and drawings of New Babylon, then in progress, and published them, were to be published in the International Situationists. But there was yet another model for Lefebvre's spatial theories that proposed itself in the late 1960s, one that had also intrigued André Breton. It was brought to Lefebvre's attention by Roland Barthes. It was the work of Charles Fourier, the early 19th century utopian thinker, whose phalanstery had become an icon for architects' imaginaries of the collective dwelling, through to Le Corbusier, whose Unité d'habitation Marseille, as you know, was a direct vertical response to the phalanstère. Lefebvre even organized a conference to celebrate the bicentennial of Fourier's death in 1972. As Stanek has it, quote, "For Lefebvre, the starting point of Fourier's project was the discovery that each social group has consistency only in its proper space, and that to invent a group and social relation is to invent or to produce a space. In that sense, the concept of the production of space itself suggests the possibility of society beyond alienation, that is to say, above all, beyond work in the modern sense. That is, with Fourier, the absolute connection that Fourier insists on between space and society, between social group and social space, in a sense, inspired Lefebvre to begin to look beyond the mechanics of space itself in urbanism to the idea of social space. The final move that confirmed Lefebvre in his concept of space production was his appointment to the chair of sociology at the University of Paris at Nanterre, a recently opened campus built in the, as you now know, the modern international style, planned with all the rigor of a functionalist modernism. There, Lefebvre supervised a range of theses devoted to the study of contemporary global urban conditions, including his student Baudrillard. There he wrote The Right to the City, The Urban Revolution, Marxist Thought in the City, and many others, the production of space culminating in 1974. When asked why the events of 1968 happened at Nanterre, Lefebvre simply replied, "Look out the window." The faculty buildings were designed for the function of education, vast amphitheaters, small functional rooms, drab halls, an administrative wing. The meaning of this morphology would soon become apparent. All this becomes the focus, he concluded, of political rebellion. This quotation from The Explosion, Marxism and the French Revolution, which was a documentary originally titled The Eruption of Nanterre, and here from Godard's film La Chinoise, another still of Nanterre, and there's another still from Godard, and what I think horrified Lefebvre and all those who went to teach at Nanterre is the shantytown or the bidonville that pressed up against, much as in any developing country now, the grand buildings of educational precision. These are photographs taken by Cartier-Bresson. Finally, completing the run-up to the production of space in 1970, Lefebvre, together with the architect and educator Anatole Kopp, an author of the first serious book on Russian revolutionary architecture and urbanism, Vie la Révolution, founded the review Espace et Société. It still goes today, but the early issues are extremely interesting because they are working out not Espace et Société, but what Lefebvre continues to call, in contradiction to espace, l'espace. It's always translated just space, but Lefebvre makes a distinction between using the word espace, which is space in general, and l'espace, which is space particularized and concretized according to a social aim, a social practice. That's a little bit of action at Nanterre. Even more action in Paris. And as you know, Paris was, again, home to the kind of occupied spaces that we might want to think about. The occupied spaces here is a diagram of all the barricades of 1832, for example. You can see every single street is covered, closed off with barricade after barricade after barricade. Illustration from Victor Hugo's Misérables of the barricades of 1832 and 1848. Interesting enough that Hugo has this wonderful passage where he talks very eloquently about these barricades. The barricades of 1832 were simply piles of debris and carts and just piled up. by 1848, he said the Parisians had learned to build barricades. There were even architects of barricades. And you see on the right, this is a barricade that is actually being built and properly organized architecturally. So, Lefebvre writes Le Droit, the right to the city. Espace politique, which was first published in 1972, is, I think, much more interesting to read in his working out of what a social space, what a political space would be, than the production of space, the later volume itself. The Urban Revolution, Pensée marxiste de la ville, espace et société, and the production of space. The production of space begins with Lefebvre's premise that space, as a concept, an ideology, and a practice, has a history, just like all other ideologically freighted terms. That history develops from what he calls absolute space, a space lived and developed in coincidence with social and religious life, what we might call traditional space, to the modern version which he calls abstract space, construed according to the developing technologies of vision from the Renaissance on, geometrical space, visual space, the space of power, or phallic or planned space. Modern space is abstract, but for all that, not unified. It contains, and this is where I think his analysis is very perceptive, discontinuities, disruptions, and contradictions. It simply has the will to be unified. And when abstract space is constituted, represented in real space, that abstract space being the architect's space, of course, represented in real space, it does so in its most reduced form, fragmented and broken according to class divisions, class experience, contradictions that tend to be ignored or illusively resolved in architectural projects. When considered as social space, space divides into space dominated and space appropriated, where the latter, as the recent appropriation or determinant of Les Halles before their demolition, he talks about this, has potential for the creation of new social spaces. Lefebvre will never relinquish the possibility of a space of modernity, fashioned through the interrelation of abstract space, of ideas, and the real space of lived experience, absolute space, a unitary understanding of social space. It is here that we can, with David Harvey, whose work on Baltimore was entitled The Space of Utopia, conserve a hope that we can develop a praxis of space that refuses to lapse into the often demagogic, if not totalitarian, nostalgia for a past that we've never experienced, and that, if truth be known, was never what they tell us. So that concludes a little bit of what I say about Lefebvre, and I'm going to juxtapose that by talking about Lefebvre's younger contemporary, Michel Foucault. Michel Foucault, of course, who most strikingly developed the notion of heterotopia. But it's interesting, if you begin to read Foucault, some of his early texts, he doesn't just get interested in space and spatiality with Surveiller Punir, with his work on the prisons, with his work on the Benthamite panopticism of modern power. But he starts very early in the 60s to talk about the language of space. It's an extraordinary essay with the title The Language of Space, which he published in 1964. It's a review of a book which was published by Michel Butor, which you can see on the screen there, which is called Description of San Marco. It's not a description in the normal sense. And it is, for Foucault, a beginning of if you like, it is as interpreting everything that St. Mark's could be through language, but also the spatiality of the page and the way in which fragments of language, fragments of conversation, fragments of inscriptions, fragments of vision, what he saw, what he sees, what tourists see, what he says, what tourists says, what the guidebook says, what the inscription says, what the space is. All those things brought together as a quote-unquote description, I think gives him literally a sense of spatial heterotopics. If space is the most obsessive of metaphors in the language of today, he writes, it's not because it offers the sole recourse, but it is in space that entry into language is deployed, slides over itself, determines its choices, draws its figures and its translations. Digression, distance, the intermediary, dispersion, fracture, and difference. And he talks about the way Boutour utilizes systematically all the spaces of language that are connected to a building of stone, interior spaces that it restitutes, sacred texts illustrated by frescoes, spaces immediately and materially superposed on painted surfaces, inscriptions and legends, ulterior spaces that analyze and describe the elements of the church, commentaries, guidebooks, neighboring and related spaces that come together by chance, words, the reflections of tourists who look, close spaces but whose gazes are turned one to the other, fragments of dialogue. These spaces are the proper places of inscription, manuscripts, surfaces of walls, books, tapes of tape recorders that one cuts up with scissors. And the triple play, the basilica, the verbal spaces, the space of writing, distributes its elements according to a double system, the sense of the visit and that described by the last blank pages on which Boutour has printed his text, with bands of words cut by the sole law of the margins, others dispersed in fragments of verse. And this organization returns perhaps to this other space again, which is that of photography. This description is here not reproduction, but above all deciphering, meticulous enterprise to unpack the excavations of the diverse languages that are things, to return each to its natural place. Reading that description, I was immediately brought back to those maps that were so carefully drawn by the inhabitants of the occupied spaces of New York and Istanbul, those maps that begin to describe in space a social set of social relationships. A little later, and it's here that Foucault becomes seriously concerned with the relationship of society, justice, and space in 1971-72, and interesting enough in conversation with the Parisian Maoists, Foucault begins to talk about the space of judgment, and he does it in the period that he establishes in 1971-72 a group for the production of information on the prisons, the Groupe d'Information sur les Prisons. And here you can see Foucault with the microphone, with the megaphone, preceded by Sartre in a demonstration against the extraordinarily terrible nature of the life in the prison, the life of prisoners. This comes before, of course, his study of the history of that imprisonment, which results in Surveiller Punir. And here he is with Sartre in reading out the declaration of prisons, and there are the little pamphlets that the society is publishing, the intolerables, and the prison against which they're demonstrating, the Fleury-Mérogis. And it's in 1972 that he goes to Attica and finds it's the first time he's ever been into a prison. Of course, in Paris, you're not, at that moment, you're not allowed inside the prison. You can only demonstrate outside. But Attica, just after the riots, the government was, and the slaughter, you remember in 71, there was a prison occupation which was finally resolved by a mediation, and refusing to accept the mediation, the governor, Rockefeller, ordered the army in, and they fired indiscriminately on the group of prisoners. 38, at least 38, were slaughtered. It's a little bit after that Foucault visits Attica and begins to, well, he has this wonderful description of it as a kind of Disneyland with its medieval fortress. This is a 1930s building. Its medieval fortress entrance, and then its incredible machine behind behind the entrance itself. And you can see here the beginnings of the prison occupation, the prisoners occupying their own prison, so to speak, and the end of the carnage at the end. And it's at this point that he begins meticulously to study the space of jurisdiction, the space of justice. And this is as I said, in a conversation with the Maoists. And the Maoists are arguing that popular justice, mass justice, is, as was practiced by Mao during the revolution, was in fact the best justice. And Foucault, I think, is a little less accepting of these rather overbroad premises, knowing what popular justice can do. As he says, in juridical justice, there is a space which organizes the justice, ostensibly at least, to be a neutral space. In popular justice, there is just masses and enemies. And he has this wonderful, he analyzes the space of the tribunal, admitting that the revolutionary tribunal during the terror manifested itself with extreme cruelty, but looking at the tribunal correctionnel. Let me, he says, a little meticulously analyze the spatial disposition of the tribunal, the disposition of the people who are in front and behind. This implies at least an ideology. What is this disposition? A table. Behind this table, which separates them, the two suitors, the thirds who are the judges. Their position indicates, firstly, they are neutral in relationship to the one and the other, and secondly, implies their judgment is not determined in advance. It's going to be established after an inquiry through the hearing of both parties, a function of a certain norm of truth and a certain number of ideas on the just and the unjust, and thirdly, that their decision will have the force of authority. This is very far, he says, from the idea of popular justice, where there are just the masses and their self-identified enemies. And it's here, in this, as he says, this meticulous description of the position of actors in space, whether or not he agrees with the juridical system or the laws that the juridical system develops, he is still extremely concerned to establish that within space and within position, there is a fundamental ideology represented, which allows him then to determine that ideology of space in the Benthamite Panopticon, illustrations from Survey Punia in 1975, and the beginnings of his, the spread of his interest in what he calls heterotopia or heterology. This had emerged long before in a 1966 radio talk entitled Of Other Spaces. It's just been published, the transcription has just been published in French. And it's very different from the later paper that he publishes in '84 in Architettura Cronache e Storia, and later again in his collected writings. And it's, again, if you read the early works of Lefebvre and the early works of Foucault, you see them working out. And it's in that working out that I think we can begin to reflect our own working out of spatial ideology and spatial politics. There are, to be sure, he says, places, realms, countries without place, histories without chronology, cities, planets, universes, of which it would be impossible to find a trace on any map or in any heaven, simply because they didn't belong to any space. Without doubt, these cities, these continents, these planets were born, as they say, inside the heads of humans, or strictly speaking, in the interstices of their words, in the thickness of their stories, or again, in the placeless places of their dreams. In the void of their hearts, in brief, this is the sweetness of utopias. Nevertheless, I think that there are, and in every society, utopias that have a precise and real place, a place that one could situate on a map, utopias that have a determined time, a time that one could fix and measure according to the calendar of the days. It is even probable that each human group whatever it is, cuts out in the space that it occupies or really lives or work, utopic spaces, and in the time that it's busy, uchronic moments. This is what I wish to say. One doesn't live in a neutral and white space. One does not live, die, or love in a rectangle of a sheet of paper. One lives, dies, and dies in a space that is gridded, cut up, variegated, with light and dark zones, differences in levels, stairs, holes, bumps, hard and fragile regions, penetrable, porous. There are regions of passage, streets, trains, subways. There are regions open to momentary pause, cafes, cinemas, benches, hotels. And then there are the closed regions of rest and being at home. Yet among these places that are distinguished from each other, there are those that are absolutely different, places that are opposed to all the others, that are destined in some way to efface them, neutralize them, and purify them. There are in some way counterspaces. These counterspaces, once localized, these localized utopias, children know them well. Certainly it's the bottom of the garden, the attic, or better still, the Indian tent set up in the middle of the attic. It is Thursday afternoon, the big bed of the grandparents. It's surely on this big bed that one discerns the ocean, since one can swim between the covers. And this big bed is also the heavens, since one can bounce on the springs. It is the forest, since one can hide there. It is the night, since one can become a ghost beneath the sheets. It is the pleasure, finally, since the return of the parents, one is going to be punished. These counterspaces, in truth, are not the sole invention of children. I think simply because children invent nothing. It is men, on the contrary, who've invented the children, to whom they've whispered their marvelous secrets. And then these men, these adults, are astonished when these children in their turn have them ringing in their ears. Adult society is organized for itself, and well before the children, its own counter spaces, its situated utopias, these real spaces outside of any places. For example, there are gardens, cemeteries, there are asylums, brothels, prisons, club med villages, and many others. Well, I dream of a science, and I mean a science, that would have for its object these different spaces, these other places, these mythical and real contestations of the spaces in which we live. This science would study not utopias, since it must reserve this name for that which truly has no place, but heterotopias, those absolutely other spaces, and necessarily the science in question will be called, it is already called, heterotopology. Then he develops 5 or 6 principles of heterotopias, how to recognize them. 1, no society exists without its heterotopias. Most societies try to repress them or suppress them from time to time, as in when it tries to suppress houses of prostitutions, but it never ever tried to suppress the cemetery. Often these heterotopias join incompatible elements in one space. The theater, which has a society in front of a stage which plays other things, other societies. The cinema, which projects 3 dimensions on a flat wall. There are heterotopias of time, like museums and libraries. Heterotopias can be open or closed, but fundamental, they contest other spaces. And he gives colonies as a heterotopic space. In short, they are already occupied spaces, prisons, clinics, and hospitals. So in that vision of a heterotopic world, I think Foucault gives us a sense of trying to think about space, which is individuated and particulated, and at the same time social. Social in the sense that it is what binds everybody together. And I think that if you go back to this notion I gave very earlier in the evening, the notion that occupation and public occupation of space which could or may not or may be public is something which is very different from representation. Representative democracy has always relied on the representative as a part of the state and developing a direct line between the people, the representative, and the state. This is what the French Revolution realized when one of the first acts of the Convention in 1792 was to ban all public meetings, even small private public gatherings that were not, in a sense, organized by the state. They were potentially seditious. It's the same when you go to the Stasi Museum in East Germany. It's an incredible array of objects for spying on people. I was very amused. They had garbage cans with cameras in the base with little holes, so presumably they would identify people by their shoes. They had logs which were lying innocently outside houses in streets without trees with cameras in them. They had bird baths with cameras in them. And they had a set of teaching photographs for the operators of the Stasi, which were to do with how to recognize from above groups of citizens that were obviously seditious, that were obviously plotting by their gestures or by their talking and so on. So in this sense, what we have to do in calibrating the sense of occupation, I'll finish that sentence in just a minute. Here we have, of course, Unger's green archipelago, as opposed to what Foucault developed in his later writing as a Gulag archipelago. This is his work with Rem Koolhaas on Berlin in Cornell in '77. A whole series of studies of these kinds of situationist neighborhoods that in one way or another could be developed as pockets of resistance to the degradation of the urban fabric. So in our understanding of occupation, and there's a little book just been published in Germany, which has I think it's 60 statements about occupation, statements about the radical nature of space. And many are those who say that the word occupation should be probably mediated, should be more appropriation. Occupation, of course, having connotations that are very much like this. So, work in progress. I'm working with Foucault and Lefebvre and their situations to try to understand whether there are strains of thought that emerge after the practices of appropriation of the 60s that we can begin to understand and theorize and think as architects about the practices of occupation of the last 2 or 3 years. Thank you.
Okay, other questions? There should be a microphone. Yes, we've got a microphone here.
Of course, it's A.L. Weitzman who's pointed out, and you know very well, he points out that radical theories of space, like Deleuze and Guattari, especially the theory of smooth space, was closely studied by the Israeli army and the Israeli military in changing their tactics in Gaza. They now no longer enter houses through doors, they go straight through houses as if they didn't exist. And quote Deleuze as they do it. Okay, no questions?
You sure?
Yes.
I just wonder, you talked a lot about people's occupation of what can be perceived public space or space, again, where they're protesting. Protesting against government or something that's not right. What about the way that government occupies the public people's space, if you like, through gentrification and moving people on and displacement and what have you?
Absolutely. That's why I find the word occupation is a very ambivalent word. What is particularly important for us, I think, is the way architecture occupies. After all, architecture precisely is that which occupies space, is that which delimits and cuts space. And I'm interested in analyzing if you like, the very strong dialectic between those lines which demarcate space physically, and those, if you like, those meanings that can be associated to a space which is demarcated physically by its social occupation. And yes, you're absolutely right. Its social occupation, precisely as Foucault understood, is as powerful as a prison, which occupies space and then is occupied by forcibly. But no, I mean, there are no easy answers to. I think what is important is the opening up of understanding of the various symbolic and active meanings of lived and social space, in order that that if resistance is to be made, strategies of resistance ought to be developed. So that it's the strategies that were so important in the prolonging of these occupations. Whatever you think of them.
It's just much clearer when it's, against an event or something that's obvious, whereas there's a lot of subversive movement and occupation by various groups.
Absolutely. And I think that there's also a difference between, the revolutionary governments in Paris in the 1790s distinguished between spaces which were occupied, like the Champ de Mars, for certain rituals or certain events, and spaces which were fluid and were spaces of manifestation and parade through the streets. Those are two very different kinds of spaces, I think. And that's another, if you like, another kind of grid that we might want to begin to tease out. The difference between a manifestation, a march, and a making of a place as a social place by just sitting still. And the sitting still is a very different kind of act than the walking, I think. Yeah.
How important do you think is the use of the word space? Because it almost seems like when you talk about a space or space that's occupied, you're really, not directly at you, but it seems like word space is a bit, it's fairly ambiguous, and it more delineates the post-rationalization of an event.
Yes.
Or an event that comes from an ideology or a situation, you could say. So I guess, that's sort of what I'm wondering is...
I think that Lefebvre faces that problem, actually, in terms of the endless kinds of spaces that can be delineated by words, right? David Harvey has a very elegant little essay, which he says is a kind of contribution to, if you like, to Raymond Williams' Keywords book, where he does this word space, which Raymond Williams doesn't deal with. And Harvey is a geographer, and he's a Marxist geographer, and he's concerned that Marx, in the traditional sense, has always been seen as someone who is a temporal thinker in the Hegelian tradition, right? And wants to, as a geographer, spatialize the politics that Marx is identifying, and does a very interesting rereading of Capital 1 and 2 in that regard. And he identifies a whole range of different kinds of spaces, but what he does do, I think, is to, I have it here. I always carry my notes with me. He basically characterizes, takes Lefebvre, his absolute relative and relational space, and gives them a certain meaning, but as he says, those meanings can only be precise in a particular moment in time, in a particular historical configuration, a particular social, ideological moment, right? I think it's worth talking about space. Obviously, geometers and geographers, and you have to have certain kinds of real space to be mapped, and then you have space-time, which is relative space, and all that kind of stuff. But I think for psychic space, for ideological space, for all these metaphorical spaces, they are ways of talking about how one inhabits. There's a remarkable little note that Freud left. He'd been not thinking about space all his life, really, or always thinking of space as a kind of Kantian absolute in which you moved, right? That kind of Miesian style. But he left a little note by his bedside saying something to the effect that his thinking had got to the point where he said, space is not universal or absolute Kant. It is projection. Space is something about the psychic projection. So you can live in a white space but feel dark, right? So there's a dark space. So I think those kinds of questions are terribly important in terms of analyzing political actions, in terms of analyzing the statements, analyzing the movements, analyzing the groupings, analyzing those. But they're also important in terms of how you plan and develop strategies. And I'm not just talking about strategies for political action. I'm talking about architectural strategies that have political and social repercussions. So underneath everything I've been saying, and I think in terms of that little long excerpt I read from Foucault, underneath that there's my belief that those are the questions that we as architects have to grapple with all the time, and that we are always far too simple and far too unaware of the conditions of space that we're dealing with. Yes.
There's a question here.
Yes.
Thank you very much. I think that's a really interesting lecture. Your lecture brings to mind the book by Fred Turner, From Counterculture to Cyberculture, The Rise of Digital Utopianism. And I think I was wondering how your argument relates to that conversation about sort of the digital space, the countercultures of the sort of San Francisco 60s, and especially because the Occupy movement seems to occupy both physical space and digital space.
Yeah, and especially Tahrir. I mean, when you go to Tahrir, it's totally, and also in Iran, Tehran. So that, yes, that's a piece of the chapter I haven't got to yet, but I'm working on it. And there is a note, one of the next paragraph that, after my Foucault Lefebvre thing is precisely, and to what extent has now metaphorical space become virtual space, and how that can be, and I think what Lefebvre would try to do, even as he tries to deal with the space of lived existence, he will try to bind that with the space of virtual communicative existence, right? Twitter space, right? Yes. We need. I think you need a mic.
In the Foucauldian articulation of power structures, there's a kind of necessity for certain, let's say, transparencies of power. One of the things that strikes me about neoliberalism and its relationship, I should say I was very involved with the Occupy LSX movement. I was part of the economic working group, and as we began to, in a sense, articulate the structure we were struggling against, one is faced by, on the one hand, an entity which is totally aspatial, by in fact colonizing all potential global locations simultaneously, and also atemporal through many means, not least of which the kind of mechanisms of finance which allow the present and the future to be dissolved. It doesn't. I wondered if you might have some.
Second, right?
I'm sorry?
In a nanosecond.
In a nanosecond.
automatically by
Absolutely. So you're dealing with, if you like, a power structure which is atemporal and aspatial, and it's not at all clear what the spatial strategies within the context of the ideas that you've been talking about this evening
Well,
might be.
I think that the only question that I guess I think that society lives in a number of different moments at the same time. And that I think that there is something, there was something incredibly important, if you like, not in terms of nostalgia, but in terms of resistance to that aspatial, about the physical, bodily occupation, right? I mean, Wall Street is no longer Wall Street. There was no Wall Street there. Wall Street's somewhere in the New Jersey meadows and in a big server in the middle of Silicon Valley, right? So Wall Street's not there. Some people work there, but they're not necessarily even the people that manage our economy, right? But just the symbolic structure of, which is why, the symbolic space is not virtual space. Symbolic space is precisely the space, it's a little bit like when Mark evoked the AA. It's not just a place to go to school. It has a symbolic connotation in relationship to its lived experience over the years, right? So I think that it's worth looking at real space in relationship to the lived experience of space. If you like, at one point when I wrote about the architectural uncanny, Mark said, oh, what you're trying to do is to get architecture to psychoanalyze itself, right? So in a sense, what I would want would be for space to be to psychoanalyze itself in order to construct a way of thinking about itself, right? And I think it came naturally, right? But I don't know whether you've heard of that, the incredible scandal in New Jersey where the approaches to the George Washington bridges were closed down, the 3 lanes. And the whole thing came down to Chris Christie, the governor, making a joke saying, well, I was out there moving the cones myself, right? So moving the cones was that physical gesture which completely jammed up, life in New Jersey for 3 days, right? So those physical moments can be quite persuasive to a population that doesn't think, as you and I do, about the concepts of virtuality, the spatiality of virtuality, or whatever. So when I say we live in different eras, right? I mean, someone who lives in the suburbs of New Jersey wants to get to work. They're not interested in, imagining what that would be in a global sense. So I think that's where an occupation can say, hey, even someone who doesn't think conceptually about this can realize the power of the gesture. Is that something that you're getting at?
Yeah, I mean, I think I had more in mind the certainly. I mean, for example, if one considers the built environment's role in the rise of a particular power group in the last 40 years, I mean, mortgages and houses and debt in particular have, and indeed presumably everyone in this room, at least from my generation, will live their lives in a condition of perpetual debt.
Right.
And that perpetual debt is in fact the sale of your future. And one of the interesting characteristics of the LSX movement was that a lot of the people were there for particular times, and of course they had to leave in order to go to their jobs, and because of their financial obligations there was no possibility, because of their temporal ownership they could not,
and that's the control mechanism.
Absolutely. So it seems in a way that already the spatial conditions of that resistance are subject to other forms of spatio-temporal domination, which are less evident as to how one might combat those.
Several blogs about the sort of the fading away of the actual physical occupation of Taksim, right? It's the summer, people are going on holiday, right? It's just as simple as that. It's in terms of the routines of life.
Can I just ask about, in a sense, about that in its relation to occupation? I mean, it seems to me that one of the problems about the way people talk about occupation is that they still inherit the language, I guess, in the 19th century, which is the one thing that trumped orthodox forms of property, which is military action, in which, in a sense, occupation had both a military, had a military definition.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, I think in Clausewitz, as it were, occupation, though he's not particularly in favor of it, but occupation means precisely where at one and the same time you control the place stroke person. I mean, it's like nothing moves.
Right.
And you could say that has a kind of heritage of being symbolized in things like saying that everyone has to be at home by 6 o'clock or,
Right.
you know, whatever the sorts of conditions of martial law are like. But it's where there's a fantastically kind of concrete and absolute notion of control. I think the problem is that to some extent, well, the revolutionaries in the early part of the 20th century, and still to some extent, you know, rely on the heritage of that language, like let's occupy, whatever it is, without having any equivalent to a sort of military strategy as to what exactly it's for. I mean, in terms of like occupation, you might think, in a sense, as indeed after all it was done in Athens once, that to gain your power you actually take everyone out of the city. I mean, you know, I'm trying to say it's not, the question of occupation should no longer be confused with any kind of military, like, takeover of something.
Right, right. And I think that's been suggested a lot. I mean, other words like appropriation and reappropriation are, I think, probably more, less military, perhaps. Yes. Hey.
Well, I wonder if we could make thinking about occupation a little more transitive by thinking of it in terms of motion and alteration. Because returning to situationism, the two great operations were dérive and détournement.
Right.
Dérive is a kind of wandering, which is a sort of errant movement that is not wholly legitimate. And détournement is a kind of hijacking, I think, a reprogramming. Now, at this point, there's a sort of intersection with the concept of program in modernism. And so, whereas occupation is a rather static kind of, seems
Right,
rather
and
static.
that's precisely
to
why I think-
reprogram is somehow to
Yeah.
rethink what actually is going on in that place, or with that built instrument.
Yeah, and that's precisely why I brought up some of those maps that were drawn, which were not static, in fact. I mean, if you look at the maps that were drawn by the participants in either Gezi Park or in Liberty Plaza, you find a continually shifting, a mobile, representation of groups that are having primacy, are building things, are not doing things, and so on. So I would actually, part of my argument, I suppose, that's latent here is precisely that space does not necessarily mean stasis, right? Space is actually something that is continuously movable as it's occupied in different moments in different ways. So I mean, it has a kind of plural. I mean, even the connotations of heterotopia that I read from Foucault, it's an incredibly pluralist sense of spaces that overlap and recombine, and it's a recombinant operation as opposed to a fixed operation.
But I think it would be one in which the appearance of the movement and the logic of the availability of the cognizability of the movement
Right.
is not necessarily under control. And I'm thinking actually, to give a simply metaphorical image, in Dan Brown's pavilions, the reflections become multiple, and you can never quite master the logic of
Right.
which way they're coming from, or which one is in front of the other, which one is figure and which is ground. There's a momentary loss of control, which is both liberating and
Yeah, especially when you bump your nose against the glass. Okay, thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you very much.